In 1187, Jerusalem, Acre, Jaffa, and nearly the whole of the Crusader kingdom save Tyre fell to Saladin. News of this sent shockwaves through Christendom. Pope Gregory VIII issued a crusade bull calling the Knights of Europe to aid the Christians in the East by defeating Saladin. Richard the Lionheart, crowned King of England in 1189, vowed to lead an army to the Holy Land. King Philip II of France also took the cross. The army Richard raised was better supplied and larger than Philip's contingent. Well-spoken, well-educated, tall, physically powerful, and an accomplished general, warrior, and poet, Richard epitomized the chivalric ideal. Philip and Richard transported their armies by sea. Philip arrived at the port city Acre ahead of Richard on April 10, 1191, where a Crusader army led by Guy of Lusignan was already besieging the city. Saladin himself besieged the besiegers, harassing them with his forces camped behind them. Meanwhile, a storm disrupted Richard's fleet, and a few ships wrecked on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus, lying just west of the Syrian coast, was currently ruled by Isaac Comnenus, an ally to Saladin. Isaac sent troops to plunder Richard's ships. When Richard arrived with the main fleet, he landed his army and immediately attacked Isaac, his superior knights making quick work of Isaac's men. By May, Richard had conquered the whole of the island, and Isaac was in chains. Richard used Cyprus as a supply source throughout the crusade. Richard arrived at Acre with much fanfare, his galleys sinking a Muslim supply ship bound for the city. The Crusaders attacked Acre with renewed vigor, Richard bombarding the walls with siege engines. On July 12th, the Muslim garrison asked for terms. Richard and Philip promised to release the men who had defended Acre in exchange for 200,000 dinars, though Saladin asked for time to raise funds. While the Crusaders settled into Acre, the deadline for Saladin's payment arrived, but the Sultan asked for more time. Richard agreed. Yet when the next deadline passed, Saladin still stalled. Richard, perceiving that Saladin was more interested in delaying the crusade than redeeming his troops, called Saladin's bluff and executed the Muslim prisoners on August 20th. With Acre back in Christian hands, King Philip considered his vow fulfilled. Against Richard's objections, King Philip returned to France, though he left the bulk of the French army behind. Now Richard alone commanded the crusade. He determined next to take Jaffa and march south along the coast. Richard arranged his forces with infantry and crossbowmen in close order with the cavalry, while supply ships shadowed them by sea. All through the march, Saladin's forces followed, harassing the Crusaders, but Richard's formation was unbreakable. Saladin, desperate to halt the Christian advance, selected a wooded area just north of Arsuf for an all-out assault. Richard was expecting this and organized his troops for battle. As the Christians emerged from the woods on September 7th, the Muslims struck, but Richard led his men in a sweeping cavalry charge that crushed Saladin's lines. After a few more charges, some 7,000 Muslims lay dead on the field, with the rest of the army fleeing. The Crusaders' victory at Arsuf shattered Saladin's reputation as a victorious conqueror. Richard took control of Arsuf and continued on to occupy Jaffa. With Jaffa once more Christian, Richard began a series of strategic raids around the coastal plain, retaking the local castles and establishing control of the region. At the same time, he sent envoys to Saladin to discuss the possibility of peace. By January 1192, Richard called council to discuss an assault on Jerusalem. The Templars and Hospitallers argued against attacking the city, since it lay inland and would be difficult to defend once Richard's army departed. Richard took seriously the opinion of these warrior monks with their long years fighting in the Holy Land. He decided to move instead on Ascalon to the south, from which he could harass Saladin's supply lines from Egypt. At Ascalon, Richard faced pressure from the army to move on Jerusalem, but by now he was set against the idea. Richard was convinced that while he could effectively control the coastal territories, moving his army too far inland would put it in an unfavorable position. On June 20th, Richard's forces intercepted and captured an enormous Muslim caravan loaded with supplies en route to Saladin's camp at Jerusalem. Saladin, humiliated by repeated defeats, attacked Jaffa on July 27, capturing all but the city's citadel. Saladin promised the garrison in the citadel that he would spare Jaffa's citizens if they would surrender, but Saladin was unable to control his troops, who sacked the city. Meanwhile, Richard, having heard about what was transpiring at Jaffa, rushed to the city's defense. As his galleys put in on the beach, Richard himself charged ashore with a handful of knights and fell upon Saladin's men. Richard and his Crusaders cut their way through Jaffa's narrow streets, purging it of Muslim troops. On August 5th, Saladin tried to dislodge Richard from the city. Richard was ready, having drawn up his little army in formation before Jaffa. Although the Crusaders were heavily outnumbered, Richard and his knights quickly cut down Saladin's advance guard. The rest of the Muslim troops, amazingly, just stood there, terrified to make a move against the King of England. In mockery of Saladin's impotence, Richard himself rode up and down the Muslim lines, his lance raised, daring the Muslims to attack him. They would not. Richard's victory at Jaffa would be the final act of the Third Crusade. On September 2nd, Richard and Saladin concluded the Treaty of Ramla, which recognized the Crusader territories stretching along the coast from Jaffa to Acre to Tyre, as well as the island of Cyprus, and a 3-year peace with Saladin's kingdom. Saladin also agreed to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem. Both sides agreed that Ascalon would be demolished. Historian Thomas Madden says that the Third Crusade was, by almost any measure, a highly successful expedition. Most of Saladin's victories in the wake of Hattin were wiped away. The Crusader kingdom was healed of its divisions, restored to its coastal cities, and secured in a peace with its greatest enemy. Andrew Ehrenkreutz, author of the book Saladin, further explains, in spite of overwhelming odds in their favor, the Muslims could neither outfight the Christian contingent, nor simultaneously protect Ascalon and Jerusalem. Considering the military organization and defense-oriented economy of the Muslim countries, and in view of the strategic advantages they secured in 1187 through 89, the terms of the 1192 armistice must be regarded as a humiliating concession the Christian invaders imposed on Islam.